This case may be a cube, but it's not for squares. Full disclosure first, the Anidees AI Crystal Cube case was sent over to me from Anidees for review. But that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to go Anidees on it. You can't pay me off just like that. Is that a whole $1? Out of the box, you get a prettier box, a fan mounting bracket that we'll go over later, and some screws. Out of the prettier box, you'll find even more screws as well as documentation for getting to the documentation. This lightweight-ish boxer enters the ring at 19.84 pounds, 12.2 inches wide, 15.8 inches deep, and 15.9 inches tall. That's 404 millimeters, so I guess technically cube not found. The body is constructed primarily of steel, some plastic, and glass panels, but we'll get back to those later. It has a dual-chamber design that supports eATX, ATX, Micro ATX, and Mini ITX motherboards with pre-installed standoffs, and a ridiculous, if not awkward, amount of cooling options. They could probably square off their website with a spell checker, but it advertises up to 10 fans. You can probably fit up to 12 in here if you ignore push-pull configurations, but to be honest with you, I'm not so sure. I kept losing count. In the front, you can fit two 120 or 240mm fans on the left, and three 80mm fans on the right. If you choose to be a cool guy and go the liquid route, you can fit a 240 or 280mm radiator with up to 100mm thickness on the left side without affecting the 80mm fans on the right. Though you will lose your 5¼ inch drive bay since you'll need to remove this support rail. There's also a spot in the front where you can mount a pump or a reservoir. If you use the included fan bracket, you can fit up to 4 120mm fans in the front, so you have the option for a more symmetrical look here. On the top, you'll find support for 4 120mm fans, or 2 140mm fans, or 2 240mm radiators, or one 280mm radiator with radiator girth support for up to 65mm before you get uncomfortably close to your motherboard. The radiator position is a little flexible. You can install it closer to the panel for more motherboard clearance if you really need it, or in the center of the case. But if you're using an all-in-one cooler, you may not be able to install the radiator in the back compartment, as the motherboard tray doesn't give the tubes enough clearance. And lastly, the back and bottom both support 120mm radiators. The back will also allow for up to one 120mm fan in the main compartment, and a 90 or 92mm fan behind the motherboard tray, as well as another pump or reservoir simultaneously. Seriously, you couldn't have kept all the little fans the same size. Just an ideas for you. Regardless, the fan support Anidees offers here is an Breeze. And what good is fan support if you don't have any dust filters? You get removable filters for the top, bottom, and front. The top and front are magnetic, and the bottom slides out from the left side. Though that front one could be a little harder to reach depending on how you want your fans configured. The ventilation on the sides of the front panel are also filtered, so you may not need to clean it out too often anyway. Speaking of fans, this case includes one 120mm fan out of the box pre-installed in the back, as well as a fan controller and a hub. In addition to this, I'll be using 6 of Corsair's HD 120 RGB fans, which I would consider to be an aggressive cooling setup. That being said, let's listen to the wind break. You'll find the Molex-powered fan controller huddled up with a reset button and hard disk activity indicator, headphone and microphone jacks, 2 USB 2.0 ports, and 2 USB 3.0 ports on the side I/O. Let's say for some strange reason, the side of the computer you want to stare at is your cable management and power supply area. You do have the option to easily swap the I/O from one side to another. And as you'd expect, atop the tower sits the power. In terms of internal support, you'll find it accommodates 7 expansion slots, which require a thumb screw to loosen this first bracket, then a screwdriver to get the rest. A max CPU height of 6.6 inches, GPUs up to 12.2 inches long, or 13.19 inches if you don't have a front fan installed. Penetrating your fans in such a manner is definitely unprofessional and mildly inappropriate. There is a cutout in the motherboard tray for mounting your cooling solution, but it's covered by the hard drive cage, so you'll need to remove that to access it. It's also a fairly small cutout, so if you're using a larger motherboard form factor, I would advise preemptively installing your cool stuff first. Back to the bottom, you'll find a spot in the main chamber for one SSD or one hard drive that can be screwed in from the bottom of the case. And behind the motherboard tray, you'll find room for up to 2 more hard drives or up to 5 SSDs if you've completely transitioned away from oppressive load times. The hard drive brackets are toolless, but none of the SSDs share this affinity. There's one 5¼ inch drive bay, but like I mentioned earlier, this is driven out if you install any larger radiators in the top or front. Lastly, you'll find another cutout in the motherboard tray towards the bottom, so you can orient your power supply in one of two ways and not starve its intake fan. Cable management in a cube case is the best thing ever since bunk beds. There's so much room for activities. You'll find a decent amount of tie-down points and cutouts, the important of which have rubber grommets, and a gap at the top to support more cable pass-throughs and water cooling tubes and radiators. Now what is it the kids are saying nowadays? Tempered glass flare or B-square? Well, this case manages to do both. You get 3 tinted 5mm thick tempered glass panels, one for each side and the front. Mounting is fairly standard for the side panels using the 4 pegs and thumb screws, while the front has the glass integrated into the detachable plastic mount, which does have ventilation at the sides for your intake fans. Though installing your fans on the outside bracket will get them close to the glass panel, which may choke some of your intake. We'll talk about that later. Tempered glass is fairly sturdy, but I still advise caution when handling, lest you find yourself with a boombox. As with any glass case, especially if it's got panels with darker tints like this one, throwing in LEDs is enlightening. And because the panels are tinted, all the LEDs will be slightly subdued, giving it a more subtle, classy look. Not at all sleazy. All these spinning colors are making me queasy. Using Corsair's HD 120 RGB fans and their node lighting system, I don't think I've ever seen anything so beautiful, and I've had a lot of really gorgeous girlfriends. You don't believe me? Yeah, okay. Just as a cat has paws, a case has flaws. So let's take a pause and lay down some laws. First off, the whole front intake solution. The fan filters are difficult to reach if you're using that front bracket, and your fans will be starved for air. Using Intel Burn Test, maxing out the case fans, and using Corsair Link's Performance Mode profile, stressing my processor for an hour with the front panel on with my i7-5820K clocked at 4.2 GHz at 1.3 volts, yielded an average of 79.5 degrees Celsius across all cores. While the case may look hot, that temperature does not. Wait, taking the panel off and running the same test gave me an average core temperature of 62.33 degrees Celsius. That being said, I recommend installing your fans inside of the case as opposed to outside with the fan bracket. However, if your temperatures aren't as much of a concern, the fans look way better front and center. The next not so rad issue is rad options. It would have been nice to be able to fit an all-in-one radiator on the far right up top, but the tubing from the rad has trouble getting around the motherboard tray. I feel like this could have been solved with a cutout towards the front of the case. And if you're a real fan of not being told what to do, this might drive you bonkers. Speaking of drives, that drive installation for the main chamber seems silly. I feel like a bracket could have been included so it can be installed from the inside of the case instead of having to flip it over to reveal its boxy bottom. This next thing isn't a huge problem since I imagine most people don't need to mount heatsinks often, but it would have been great if the motherboard cutout was just a little larger and not obstructed by the hard drive cage. Though if you don't use hard drives and you don't have that many SSDs, it can be removed. Maybe some people prefer that area covered up. But if you've got SSDs, you'll end up covering too much, because mounting them actually covers up some of the rubber grommets. I think a special mounting bracket could have been done here. There's so much space between the motherboard tray and the side panel that I'm sure a riser of some sort could have been made to pass cables under and mount SSDs over. Cable management in this is super simple. Don't take it away from me by obstructing cutout access. Speaking of cutouts, each one of them should be equipped with its own rubber grommet. The cutouts designated to support eATX boards go naked, and when you're naked, you feel powerless. Or empowered, depending on what you're into. Speaking of power, the last thing to note, be careful with that front panel installation. I snapped off half of the power switch because apparently I build computers like a barbarian. All that being said, I do like the options it provides. Plenty of room for 120mm fans, decent radiator support. The ability to swap the I/O from left to right is pretty neat, I guess. And who would pass on that glass? But Anidees. What about the Anidees? For its $140 price tag, is it expensive? Maybe a little. Is it worth it? There are a number of cube cases on the market, but most of them are cheaper with less features. This one's closest competitors are the Corsair Carbide Air 540 and Air 740 cases, both of which are around $120 to $150. Both Corsair cases won't support as many fans, but the 740 case does allow for a 360mm radiator. However, both of the Corsair options do come a little larger than the Anidees, and neither of them are equipped with tempered glass. Another option is the recently released Minute 4PM case. It's a smidge smaller according to Newegg's description, but also has 3 tempered glass panels, pump and reservoir support, and includes 5 of their fans. but at the cost of a front dust filter and EATX motherboard support. Both the 4PM and AI Crystal Cube look strikingly similar, leading me to believe they may actually be copies of each other. And while they offer slightly different options, out of all the cube cases we just glossed over, I definitely think the Anidees option looks the best. If your only concern is appearance, I'm sure you'll be pleased. That is, assuming you can get over the front air intake issue and you've got a solution for the SSDs causing that rubber grommet and a squeeze. Time to see myself out before I make another cheesy pun. So that's all I have to say about that. Like, dislike, comment, subscribe, share, leave me questions if you've got them. Thanks for watching. My name is Steven and I am ALittleDIMM. Bye bye. Out of the blue, you get a blue? It says box. Enters the ring at 19 point. I stuttered. Why did I stutter? They could probably square off there. They could probably square off the square. Like, emphasize it like I mean it. Pretend it's a good joke and you want people to notice. Except it's a bad joke and I probably don't want people to notice. Or 280mm or 280mm without affecting the 80 or 200. You'll find support for balls. On the top, you'll find support for balls. No, you won't. Not unless you want your balls stuck in a fan. Or two 240mm or one 280mm radiator. Or one 280mm with radiator 280mm radiator 280mm. I quit YouTube. I can't say millimeter. The fans support Anidees office here. This case includes one 120mm huddled up with a reset button and a hard disk or a tray for your the best thing ever since bunk beds. Why did I pause? I paused because I was leaving room for activities. Installing your fans on the outside. Brack. I didn't finish typing that word. All these spinning colors are making me queasy. That's bad. That is really bad.